Welcome to News Conference Extra, a special segment on Today in LA Weekend. Dave Regan is president of the Service Employees International Union United Healthcare Workers West on this Labor Day. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
From your point of view, and you've been in organized labor for how many years?
24.
What is the state of unionism in California?
It is in decline, and if we're not careful, we are in grave danger of not having labor movement to speak of in the not too distant future. Decline
in the private sector and the public sector?
In both, yes.
Why do you believe that is?
Well, it's not what I believe, it's actually a fact. There are less people in unions every year, and this has been a long time historical trend where we're now at the point where only 6% of private sector workers are represented by labor unions. And in the mid-20s for public sector workers, but declining. And frankly, that schism between private sector unionism and public sector unionism is in large part what's driving this attack on public employees, and particularly pension benefits and health care benefits and those types of things. There's a real difference between the two sectors, but all of it can be traced to the steady decline of labor, and we have to do something quickly or we're going to disappear.
Well, let's talk about that. Private versus public, because you have the private sector unions and their members paying for the benefits of the public sector. And is there consternation in the union movement between these two sectors?
You know, I think there is. I know there is. And the trick here is we have to figure out, in conjunction with policymakers and elected officials and all of that, is how do we not all point the finger at public sector workers and be jealous of what they still have. The real trick is that this economy doesn't work for over 80% of wage earners in America. And most people know that. People feel their standard of living declining. But the fact of the matter is the labor movement has been unable to do anything about it. So the first thing we have to do is we have to demonstrate, both in words and in deeds, that unions in America care about the common good, all workers, not just union members. And secondly, we have to figure out how do we make the problem about lifting everybody up, not pointing the finger at this enclave of public sector workers who still have things that most people don't. It's a hard thing to do. It starts with us being willing to be different and taking seriously that we will not survive unless we're prepared to do things very differently and very quickly.
When you say very differently, remember, we're talking about an adversary relationship between management and labor. That's the way the union movement, and that's all we know. Are you arguing that that's got to change?
I am.
But how do you? So it's in the culture of unionism.
It is, and the culture of unionism is failing. And I think now what most people in this global economy, the economy is very different today than it was 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 70 years ago when the modern labor movement really was born. Then it was a manufacturing society, and this whole notion of we have employers and we have workers, that was accepted. The truth is we live in a society and a world right now where the way you succeed is through collaboration, is through teamwork. And frankly, I think unions have to figure out how do we advocate for the economic interests of our members and workers generally at the same time that we recognize that the industries we work inside of themselves have to be healthy. Because if they're not, the jobs will be moved to India, to China, to Latin America. And we have to move beyond that outdated us versus them mentality. And I think we have to think about strategic collaboration, but as the way where workers will gain more through that than through an outdated mode that you've described.
But you've also talked about going to the ballot box in California, going past the legislature, maybe the $15 an hour minimum wage. Does that not fall into the narrative of a campaign against business by going to the ballot box and going to the voters?
No, I don't think it does. And I think this is also, just like the public is cynical about unions, the public is more cynical about the failure of government to lead and to do its job. There are lots of things in California that great majorities of the public are for that just cannot be moved through a state legislature or moved through other legislative bodies. And so what we're advocating as part of figuring out how do we become relevant again by operating at a larger scale, how do we put questions of direct economic fairness in front of tens of millions of people, where voters get the chance to weigh in directly on some core questions, whether it's the minimum wage, whether it's pay equity, whether it's student debt, whether it's consumer debt. There's lots of things that Americans care about and Californians care about, and too often the political system doesn't act on it, and unions have lost the ability to do it through collective bargaining, and I think we need to look to other ways.
We're going to carry on this conversation on NBC4's news conference. That program